Hey art nerds, I am back at it with my AliExpress shenanigans. Today, we're going to talk about a really unusual watercolor palette that I purchased off of AliExpress. If you're interested in learning more about the superior collapsible watercolor cup, then keep watching. I first came across this product in the Paintbox, my art-centric Discord server, and there was a link to the listing on AliExpress. And I'm always really interested in unusual watercolor palettes, so I decided to give this one a try. It arrived after about a month. I had to go to Louisiana, and it came in a craft paper mailer with some bubble wrap, and then this fairly thin cardboard packaging. And this is made by Ningbo Superior Art Material Co. And it was purchased through DINGYI on AliExpress. I'll have links down in the description below. You can check it out on the Superior website, or you can get your own in the description. So what it is it's a small acrylic and plastic watercolor palette that sits on top of a collapsible watercolor pot. So it's really ideal for travel watercolor. The packaging itself is fairly simple and meant to be disposable. It didn't really provide a whole lot of protection in mailing, but fortunately this is a really sturdy product. And you do have some different color options, as you guys could see on the box itself. And you also have the option of ordering an additional lanyard with your watercolor pot. And what that's for is for when you're out traveling, you can carry your watercolor palette around your neck. So this was a little bit larger than I expected. The sides are designed with 3 slots to hold your brushes, and then there's also 2 grooves on the top of the expanded pot to rest your brushes while you're painting, while you're out in the field. Once folded up, the design is fairly compact. You guys see on the left-hand side there's a slot. That would be for you to clip your lanyard on. And the bottom seems to be made of the same sort of plastic that's typically used for these sort of collapsible containers. And I'm certainly no stranger to the collapsible containers. I have used the Faber-Castell Click and Go watercolor cups for a really long time. This is a great way to save space and to be able to bring your watercolor pot with you as you're painting. So on this channel, I've reviewed a few different unusual watercolor products. I'll show you guys a few of my favorites a little bit later on in the video. So you guys can probably imagine it was difficult for me to resist this one, because this one allows you to bring your water with you. Now what I would recommend is you bring a bottle of water, and then you can use this wash cup instead of having to use a water brush or to scrub out using a paper towel. So inside the palette itself, there are 12 full wells and 4 half wells. They're fairly deep, and the bottom seems to be made of clear acrylic. And I think tube watercolors are really best for this palette. There's also a silicone gasket that fits tightly on the palette to help keep your paint fresh while you're painting. And then there's a latch that helps keep everything together. The pot is easy to extend. I have butterfingers. As you guys can see, there's the 3 holes on the side to hold your brushes. Not going to be a one-size-fits-all scenario. You saw that brush just slip through the largest setting, and if you put it in the middle setting, it would just sit there at the top. So you're going to want to be picky-choosy if you are using this sort of in your hand or on a stand. So it's a little bit much to juggle when you're out in the field, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on. Then when you're done painting, you can collapse the cup and then reinsert your palette into your water pot and click it all together. It took me a little while to get the hang of it, but once I figured out the mechanism, it was very easy and very quick for me to put it together and take it apart repeatedly. And it's also very sturdily built. It's bigger than I expected when I saw it on AliExpress. They gave the specs, but there's something about that never just clicks in my mind. The build quality is way better than I really expected. I didn't order the lanyard, so I would have to provide my own. You could put a paint puck in the bottom of the cup to help with scrubbing. And it's not really a full travel kit, but it's very compact, and it's the first kit I've seen to include a sizable wash bucket. You've got plenty of wash bucket. It's easy to assemble and disassemble. Now you are limited with your mixing area, but you can use the top of the paint container for your mixes. And I have a field test in this video where I'll demonstrate that. And generally, I've been impressed with the quality of Superior products, if not always the ergonomics of design. I've actually reviewed several Superior brand products here on the channel, from that folding watercolor fan to the travel watercolor watch that I really liked. Actually, I thought that was really innovative. So I'd like to see them to continue to offer innovative watercolor and art supplies to the masses, because really somebody needs to. We need some new life and we need some good design in our watercolor products. So there are a lot of different travel watercolor palettes on the market. Some of them include the paints inside, some of them don't. This one doesn't come with the paints, which if you're a newer watercolor artist, you might find that a little bit disconcerting because it means you've got to provide your own. But if you have your own paints, if you've been painting for a while, you may actually see this as freeing like I did, because it invites you to select your own palette of favorite watercolors. So really, all this provides is the container, the actual palette itself, not the paints that you're going to use. So it invites you to figure out your own favorite palette. As you guys can see though, it is fairly easy to assemble and disassemble. So speaking of palette, I swatched a bunch of different watercolors to try and find exactly what I was looking for this palette. And while during COVID, I don't travel for pleasure as much as I'd like, I love going to botanical gardens and doing plein air painting. And this palette is a great opportunity to kind of curate my own favorite botanical watercolor selection and get out there and paint. So I swatched a bunch of colors in order to find the ones that I felt would work best for my botanical palette. And these are the colors I used. Neutral Tint from Holbein, Bismuth Yellow from M Grams, Quin Gold, Daniel Smith, old version, thanks to Kabocha, Scarlet Lake from Winsor & Newton, Permanent Alizarin Crimson from M Grams, Cerulean Blue from Winsor & Newton, Ultramarine Deep from Sennelier, Marine Blue from Magello, Undersea Green from Daniel Smith, Green Gold from Winsor & Newton, Burnt Sienna from M Grams, Sepia from PwC, Chinese Orange from Sennelier, Mineral Violet from Holbein, Quin Violet from Daniel Smith, and Opera from Holbein. And I was looking for tube watercolors, professional grade, that reactivate quickly, deliver a lot of beautiful color. Now this is a botanical palette, but you guys might notice there's not a lot of green in here. There's only two greens, Green Gold and Undersea Green. And that's because when I'm out painting in the field, I really love the greens I can achieve by mixing cooler yellows like Bismuth Yellow with cooler blues like Magello's Marine Blue. You get some really beautiful, fresh, lively greens that way. Now, I did include a fair number of reds, a fair number of yellows, and I was even picky about what purples I included. There's two violets in this set, Mineral Violet and Quin Violet, because if I want something a little bluer, I'm going to mix the ultramarine deep in. And I stayed away from dioxine violet, even though I love that color, because in the field it can feel very synthetic, it can be very overwhelming, it can really take over your mixes. So you guys might notice that even though this palette is fairly small, and even though we get 4 half pans in the corners there, you actually have plenty of room to apply your paint. It's a very generous little palette actually. You're gonna have plenty of paint while you're in the field. Also want to point out that it's actually very easy for me to get my brushes in there, and I didn't have as much cross color pollution as I thought I would. And the silicone gasket at the top does a great job of keeping your paints fresh, which means they reactivate faster. Normally, I would allow my paints to dry fully and then use that as a travel palette, because that way they don't just go all over the place. But since this palette has a gasket that kind of keeps the paints in place and keeps them from migrating, you don't need to worry about that. So if you like painting with fresh tube paints, this is a great travel palette for you, and it allows you to take just as much as you would like. I also think that the 16 total wells, again, 12 are fairly sizable full wells and for our half-size wells, I feel like, I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought there. You get plenty of paint though. There's plenty of room for paint, and you can bring all of your favorites. I think 16 is a very generous number of paints to be able to bring for plein air painting. Also, since this palette keeps the paints really nice and fresh, you can use this as a travel gouache palette. So here we are putting the silicone gasket back in place. You do want to kind of keep it in the same orientation time and time again. That'll help prevent pollution. And I'm using a Q-tip just to clean up some of the overages from some of these paints. Now you probably could put half pans in here if you wanted to, just drop them in. But the point of this palette is to keep your paints fresh and moist, and half pans are already dried out. So this isn't really the best palette if you're a half pan person exclusively. I will say though, before using this palette, I did think I was almost exclusively a half pan person because I feel they're generally easier to handle. And this palette actually changed my mind. I really enjoyed painting with this palette. And I know some of it was the selection of paints that I included. I included some really great paints in here, paints that I really love and that really make me happy. Paints, some of them have good granulation, some of them have good color shading like the green gold, and some of them are just beautiful, beautiful colors like marine blue and ultramarine deep and permanent alizarin crimson with decent granulation. But this palette made bringing those colors out into the field in this format way more accessible for me. You guys will notice that I demonstrate assembling and disassembling this palette several times in this video. It's because it does take a bit of a knack. If you use what is on the right hand side, the latch, and you notch that in first, you can just kind of push the back hinge in since there is some give in the container. And that has been the easiest way for me to assemble this thing. Hey art nerds, so we're heading over to the New Orleans City Park Botanical Garden today, and I thought it'd be a really good opportunity to field test the Superior watercolor palette. So earlier I went ahead and I put in what I thought would be a pretty ideal mix of color for the type of field painting I do, which is mostly botanical illustrations or studies. So we have here, hopefully, a very useful color selection. I tried to get a good gamut. And this Superior travel palette, I think it kept everything really moist, which I think is the point. But as a watercolor artist, I usually work from dried half pans because they tend to be a little less sloppy. So we'll see how I feel about this, but it has a silicone cover that slots in and kind of keeps everything wet. Also has a small mixing surface and a generous water bucket. I'm not sure what I'm going to do to dispose of the water when we're out in the field, but that'll be part of the review, I guess. And this thing can attach to a lanyard for easy travel. And I've had a lanyard pulled out and I don't know what happened to it, so I may have to go grab another lanyard before we head out, since it's meant to wear, I thought it was going to be a lot smaller when I ordered it. It's meant to wear kind of like a locket. So let's go ahead, head out into the field and see how this handles. So as I mentioned earlier, this isn't really a full travel watercolor kit. You bring your own brushes, you bring your own paper towels, if you need extra mixing surfaces, you bring that. But frankly, there is no perfect travel watercolor palette, and I'm not really the biggest fan of travel watercolor brushes, and water brushes are kind of iffy for me. So for me, packing my own brushes in a brush roll isn't really a pain point, since I am going to be bringing a bag anyway. However, it does keep things pretty compact. The only regret I really have with this is I wish I'd brought a little bottle of water with me to the botanical garden. It would have been a lot easier than tracking down water fountains to refill. And a brush roll like this, or a bamboo brush roll, and I can link those down in the bottom, will help protect your favorite watercolor brushes when you're traveling. So for this trip, I brought a synthetic flat, about an inch wide synthetic flat, and 2 watercolor rounds, the black velvet watercolor rounds, one in a 4 and one in an 8. So I really only needed 3 brushes for this. I also packed a pencil and a Sakura Micron, since those are waterproof, as well as some paper towels. So you don't really need a whole lot of extra stuff with this palette. Okay, Joseph and I are heading off to the New Orleans City Park Botanical Gardens, but honestly, all of City Park is pretty gorgeous and well worth exploring if you're in the area. So I think I'm gonna take a quick painting break and try to paint some of these water lilies here. So since this watercolor kit doesn't come with water and I didn't bring a bottle of water, I'm gonna head back over to that WPA water fountain and fill the water container. So we found a handy nearby bench and I got myself settled in. I did have to trek to find a water fountain to fill my little watercolor pot, and there's no way to close off or contain used water. So if you do work with toxic pigments, or you really muddy your water a lot, or there's nowhere convenient to dispose of the water, then you are going to need to figure that out before you actually head out. Fortunately, I don't really work too much with toxic pigments, and I was able to discreetly pour it out into a bush. So since I was working from still tacky, still wet watercolor paints, everything activated really quickly and I was able to develop some really vibrant color. The watercolor wash pot is sizable, so even though I was using just one wash pot to clean my brushes, I never found that my colors got too muddy while out in the field, although you may want to switch your water out in between subjects. I also found that my 3 brushes were fairly adequate for what I was trying to do, and the small mixing surface, I'm using the interior of the lid as the mixing surface, I assume that's what it's designed to do, worked quite well for my purposes. I didn't really need a whole lot more space. I'm painting in a small watercolor sketchbook. It's a cellulose sketchbook, about 5 by 7, and my mixing area was fairly decent for this. Now, something that would maybe be nice to see with this might be some larger wells on the mixing surface, or maybe like an additional mixing surface that you could clip on, something modular like that. I do have a review of the Portable Painter Micro coming up that you guys might be interested in checking out. So if you like travel watercolor palettes, please consider subscribing and keeping an eye out for that by clicking the bell notification so YouTube lets you know when we have something new on the table. Now, I didn't put white gouache in my palette, so that might be something that you want to do for your palette if you like adding white highlights back in. If you're a plein air painter who likes to stand at an easel, or you like to stand and hold your paints as you sketch, this is not the palette for you. Check out the Superior Watch palette that I reviewed in the past. I'll link that in the cards and in the description below. Demonstrating ease of cleaning the mixing surface before we put it away. It should be easy. I mean, it's just white plastic. And it was actually enough to serve my needs. You don't really need a whole lot when you're painting at about 5 by 7 for field work. My only complaint, well, I have a couple complaints. One complaint would be to have like an additional large well for mixing up washes, but if you kind of think strategically you could utilize this for that. And then my other complaint is that you can't attach this mixing surface to your water cup in any way. And that would be really handy because then you could sit it to the side and it didn't have to be on your lap. But other than that, I'm pretty pleased with it so far, and I really like that I can use my colors, so I can use what I'm comfortable with. So you can make a travel palette for plein air in the city or botanical painting or whatever you prefer. Okay, so all clean. I tried not to get these too muddy. The fact that they stayed semi-wet meant that they reconstituted very readily and I could paint very quickly. Oh, it's important, forgot to put the silicone flavor saver in there so that these paints don't dry out too much. Now, my other concern is I have a pot of water, and getting water out here is a little bit tricky. I had to walk a little bit to get to a water fountain. So I have some options. I could discreetly dump it in the grass, or I could try to bring it with me, but I'm afraid that would ruin my watercolors. So doing something about your water in your water pot is also a concern. Alright, so that was our trip to the botanical gardens, and it gave me a chance to field test my Superior watercolor palette. I'll check in with you guys at the house with my final thoughts. So I'm the kind of watercolor artist who likes to sit and paint since it can take a really long time, and I sometimes have trouble editing it myself. So I found that this palette worked really well for me in the field, but I also wanted to test it out at home. How might this palette work if you decided this was going to be your standalone home watercolor palette, since 16 wells gives you a lot of options, and this could be a really great option for an artist who's maybe just getting started out or doesn't have a lot of space to work because it's so compact and it packs up really neat and tidy. So I decided to do some painting in my own home studio, my new home studio, since we just got moved in, using the same watercolor sketchbook and the same palette. And that's another pro for this little watercolor palette. It can really work well as a limited space indoor palette, since there's nothing inherently travel about it. It doesn't come with travel brushes. So if you're an artist or a student who has a smaller workspace to work with, or you're just not really that invested in watercolor, but you like using them sometimes and you want them ready to go when you're ready to go, this little palette could be an excellent option for you. So in this watercolor study, since I'm painting at home, I'm using a little bit of masking fluid to mask off my water lilies and my lily pads. And I put my masking fluid in a smaller container so that my original container of masking fluid doesn't become polluted and it doesn't dry out too much. I put down an initial wash of cerulean blue, and then a mix of the neutral tint with a little bit of undersea green and a little bit of sepia to sort of get that darker, more tannin-filled water that we saw with the water lilies. You guys can probably see that even though we have a fairly small mixing surface to work with, we do have plenty of room, and you can mix up larger washes if you're strategic. So that's why I started with the background wash first, kind of worked on completing that, and then I'll clean off that mixing surface so I have room to mix my other colors. That's one of the nice things about this sort of mixing surface is it's very, very easy to wipe off with a paper towel, just slightly damp paper towel. You can even use the water from your wash bucket. And I did notice that some of the colors like opera and marine blue do have a tendency to stain the palette itself. Now normally my trick for that would be to use a melamine sponge like a Mr. Clean Magic Eraser to clean my palette. It doesn't quite work on that. So if you care a lot about your palette becoming stained and maybe kind of affecting how you perceive the colors, that is something to keep in mind. Now you could also possibly use the silicone gasket that's used to keep your colors fresh, to keep your paint still damp, you could possibly use that as an area to mix up a slightly larger amount of undiluted color, and then you could just wipe that out as well. It's really up to you. So that might offer more mixing options. I don't think that's what it's designed for, but I have seen photos on AliExpress where people have done that. So, you know, it might be worth exploring, and your mileage may vary. So, as I've mentioned before, I've reviewed a few different Superior products in the past, and I'm generally satisfied with the products I receive. Sometimes they're good in theory and not great in practice. This one is great in theory and great in practice. I really like it. I like seeing innovation in art supplies, and Superior offers interesting watercolor palettes that are often copied by other manufacturers. I purchased this collapsible watercolor cup and palette after Maddy shared the listing in the Paintbox, and I paid about $10, maybe $11 for it. Now, since it's from AliExpress, it will take a little while to get to you, so just keep that in mind, and I'm sure US-based retailers will get on the ball and start carrying this at a hefty markup in the near future. So even though I painted two fairly successful studies using this palette where there was no color map, I really like having a color map. It helps me kind of remember what colors are what after a long period of time has passed since I've used the palette, and it also gives me an opportunity to label what brands each colors are, since I spent a lot of time swatching colors and even swatching the same color name between brands in order to find the best fit for this palette. I didn't want to just forget that. So I'm making a custom color map for this. Now, I did trace it, and that's a little bit large, so I do have to cut it down quite a bit, as you guys can see here. That's not really a big deal. Now, what is a bigger deal is this palette shuts so tight, which is great. It keeps it airtight, it keeps your paints from running all over the place, and it keeps your paints fresh. But it means there isn't really any room at the top for your watercolor map. So if you're like me and you need a watercolor map, you may decide you want to put it on the back side and thus mirror your colors, or you may want to put it on the top for easy reference. So when you're scrounging around for the perfect travel palette, you're able to grab this one. Alright, so you guys are probably wondering, would I recommend this palette? Is this a good palette for you? So let's talk about the pros and the cons. The pros of this Superior Collapsible Cup watercolor palette are: there's a generous wash bucket, sturdy construction, it feels and handles like a quality product, it's not janky, and there's no unfinished edges. The paint stays damp in the palette, which allows for fast reactivation and helps prevent chunks of watercolor from falling out. The silicone gasket keeps paint fresh and also keeps them from running into other pans. The pan size is generous. You can add a lot or a little, it's up to you. There's room for 16 colors, and this allows you to create a functional and versatile personal palette to suit your preferred travel style, which also means this could function as an at-home watercolor palette as well. So what are the cons? Well, it's bigger than I expected, but this isn't really a con. The white mixing surface is prone to staining. There's nowhere really to keep a swatch sheet. I tried fitting one in, and it makes it way harder to open and close, so I taped it to the front. It's difficult to remove paints you don't need or changed your mind about. There's no deep wells for larger mixes, just one large mixing surface. You can't attach a palette to the paint bucket, so it does have a larger footprint. You may be resting the palette on your lap, and there's no additional way to like clip on other palettes as well. If you lose the silicone gasket, you're probably SOL. I don't know if this palette would work nearly as well. And the stains don't come off with a melamine sponge like Mr. Crean, which is usually great for cleaning gunky palettes. There's a lot going in favor of this watercolor palette, so what's my verdict? Well, small nitpicky complaints aside, I really like this thing. I like collapsible water cups. Like I said, I use the Faber-Castell ones all the time, and I like how this one isn't fussy. For a travel palette, it is both compact and holds a lot of paint and a lot of colors, and could easily be a compact solution for students and people with limited space. For watercolor, there's no perfect palette solution that will suit every artist. You just have to figure out what works best for you personally. This set doesn't come with travel or water brushes, doesn't have a million mixing surfaces, doesn't really fit in a woman's pocket, and doesn't come with included paints. And it won't do your painting for you. But travel sets often come with crappy brushes, so you usually want to bring your own. And too many mixing surfaces may overcomplicate things. And you may not like the paints that came with the travel palette. I particularly like that you can customize your palette. This one has been curated for botanical studies, opera rose, undersea green, green gold, marine blue. This travel palette lets me include the best of all brands, so I get to customize my painting experience to my preferences. Alright, so that about wraps it up for the Superior Collapsible Watercolor Cup. I really like this thing. I feel like I'm going to be using this a lot. As I mentioned in the video, it's fairly compact. You get a sizable watercolor cup. Like, this is a pretty large watercolor cup. And you also get to use your tube watercolors and all the benefits of using tube watercolors in the field with none of the mess. This gasket does a really great job. Now, from time to time, you can see it's starting to pick up paint. There's paint getting in the edges. You may want to clean this thing out just to kind of freshen it up so you're not polluting your paint too much and you're not mixing it. You guys can see during the review, I did cross pollute a little bit. If you're kind of fussy about color purity, if that's important to you, then clean your palette. And if you're wondering why I'm even talking about it, then clearly that's not something that's going to bother you. You can order these on AliExpress. I'll put a link down in the description below. When you are replacing the gasket, just make sure you press it firmly and it'll just slot right in. This thing is built really well. It's pretty sturdy. And then just clamp the top, and then you can slip it into the back. Well, actually, I recommend you do it the other way. You slip it in the front first, and then it'll expand, and you can just click the back in, and then you click that latch down. And once you get the hang of it, it gets really easy to use. It's a little bit big to wear around your neck, a little bit bulky. As a purse and bag carrier, I already get annoyed with my bags and my purses slinging all over the place, so this might be more of a bag object than a pocket object, but don't worry, I've got other smaller travel watercolor palettes coming up in the near future. In fact, during the review, I mentioned the Portable Painter Micro, so keep an eye out for the review of this in the future. I have a CMYK inspired palette in this one that I'm just dying to try out. And I also mentioned the Superior Watch Watercolor Palette. I've reviewed this in the past, and I had a lot of fun with this one, and I really liked it. So I will link the review and the field test for this one in the description if you're curious about more travel watercolor palettes and you're the sort of painter who actually prefers to paint standing up. So that about wraps it up. I hope you found this review of the Superior Collapsible Watercolor Cup to be helpful, useful, and informative. This product was purchased out of my own pocket because it was something that I thought seemed genuinely useful, and I'm really happy to be able to share it with you guys because it might help one of you find something that you're going to love. So if you enjoyed this video, make sure you leave a thumbs up. I'd love to hear from you guys in the comments, and I hope you guys will check out some of my other videos as well. Have a wonderful day, guys. I hope to see you guys again really soon. Bye, guys.